Today, we're ranking every major handgun of World War II, from the ones that jammed when soldiers needed the most to the sidearms so reliable it became a legend and outlived the war itself. 10. Nambu Type 94, Japan. The Type 94. Japanese production introduced in 1934. And I want to be honest with you, this pistol is something of a legend, just not for good reasons. The Type 94 was chambered in 8mm Nambu, an underpowered cartridge that struggled with stopping power even in ideal conditions. But the cartridge isn't even the worst part. There's a small sear bar on the outside of the frame. You can see it. It sticks out on the left side of the receiver. And if you pressed it while the weapon was cocked, even accidentally, it would fire, without touching the trigger. Not a design flaw they discovered after manufacture. It was there from the start. It was there in every single one of the approximately 71,000 units produced. Japanese officers who carried this pistol were often issued it not because it was good, but because it was available. Japan's industrial capacity was increasingly strained by 1942, and quality control suffered badly. There's a cruel irony here. A man deep in the Pacific jungle, fighting for his life, reaches for his sidearm in desperation, and the holster itself might set it off. Worst handgun of the war, and it's not particularly close. 9. Glisenti Model 1910, Italy. Italy entered the war with one foot already in the past. The Glisenti Model 1910 looked modern, semi-automatic, 9mm, at least in caliber. But here's the thing. The Glisenti cartridge, while dimensionally similar to the 9mm Parabellum, was loaded to significantly lower pressures, about 25% less powerful. Why does that matter? Because Italian soldiers sometimes got their hands on standard 9mm Parabellum rounds, from captured weapons, black market trades, desperate resupply. And if you loaded a standard 9mm Parabellum round into a Glisenti, the weaker action could fail catastrophically. Combine that with a complex takedown mechanism that baffled soldiers in the field, a frame that was genuinely fragile under stress, and a 7-round magazine that felt generous only compared to revolvers, and you have a sidearm that inspired very little confidence. The Italian infantrymen deserved better. 8. Webley Mark VI, Britain. Now, this one will raise some eyebrows, because the Webley has fans, and for good reason. It's a .455 caliber top-break revolver with a legendary history stretching back to the Boer War and the trenches of World War I. But by 1939, it was old, and the world had moved on. The .455 Webley round was actually replaced by the British military with the .38-200, a lighter, smaller cartridge for the official service revolver, the Enfield No. 2. The Webley Mark VI continued to see service largely because there simply weren't enough modern sidearms to go around. It's bulky, it's slow to reload even with the top-break mechanism, and at 2.4 pounds loaded, it's heavy. In the jungles of Burma or the cramped alleys of North Africa, that weight adds up. Respect where it's due. It had stopping power. But this was a gun fighting a modern war with Great War DNA. 7. FN Model 1910, Belgium/Germany. Here's a gun with an interesting wartime biography. The FN Model 1910 was a Belgian design. FN, Fabrique Nationale, the company that John Browning helped build into one of the great firearms manufacturers on Earth. A compact, reliable .32 ACP or .380 ACP semi-automatic. Then, Germany invaded Belgium in 1940, seized the FN factory, and put it to work producing this very pistol, among others, for German officers, police, and rear area personnel. So here you have a Belgian gun, made by Belgian workers under German occupation, being issued to German officers. The Belgians who made them almost certainly did not have Germany's interests at heart. There are documented cases of deliberate sabotage at occupied factories throughout the war. As a pistol, it's fine. Accurate, reasonably reliable, slim enough to conceal. But the calibers, particularly .32 ACP, were light for combat use. Officers carrying this were hoping they never actually had to use it. 6. Radom VIS 35, Poland. This is where we start getting into genuinely good guns. Guns that, under different circumstances, might have changed the world's opinion of Polish engineering. The Radom VIS 35, sometimes called the VIS, was developed in the early 1930s and was, by every objective standard, a sophisticated, modern pistol. Chambered in 9mm parabellum, single action with an 8-round magazine and ergonomics that felt natural in the hand. German soldiers who captured them kept them. That tells you something. When soldiers willingly swap their issued sidearm for a captured one, the captured one is doing something right. The tragedy is that Poland was overrun in 1939. The factory fell into German hands, and production continued, but for Germany, not for Poland. Many of the Poles who designed and built this weapon spent the rest of the war as occupied subjects or in the resistance. A great gun with a heartbreaking story. 5. Tokarev TT-33, Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not design weapons for comfort. They designed them to work. The Tokarev TT-33, chambered in 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev, was a high-velocity pistol round that punched well above its caliber. The 7.62 Tokarev traveled fast, around 1,400 feet per second from a standard load, and had remarkable penetration. Against the light body armor and heady winter clothing of the Eastern Front, that mattered. The TT-33 was simple, robust, and stripped down to its essentials. Fyodor Tokarev essentially took John Browning's tilting barrel design, simplified it further, and built something a factory worker could assemble and a conscript could maintain. 2 legitimate knocks. The safety was minimal to the point of being almost absent on early models, and 7.62 Tokarev ammunition wasn't interchangeable with anything the Western Allies used, creating supply complications. But if you were a Soviet officer on the streets of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-1943, this was a pistol you could trust. 4. Walther P38, Germany. By 1938, the Wehrmacht had a problem. The Luger P08, which we'll get to, was a beautiful pistol. It was also expensive, labor-intensive, and difficult to manufacture at scale. Germany needed to arm millions of soldiers. The Luger wasn't up to that task logistically. Enter the Walther P38. Karl Walther's design was a breakthrough in production practicality. The P38 introduced a double-action trigger to a major military service pistol, meaning you could carry it with a round chambered and the hammer down and fire it with a single long trigger pull. Safer, faster to deploy. It was chambered in 9mm parabellum, held 8 rounds, and was far easier and cheaper to manufacture than the Luger. German industry could produce them at scale. The P38 wasn't flashy. It was blocky, almost utilitarian by comparison with some of its competitors. But in the field, it was reliable, accurate, and ergonomically solid. Captured P38s were valued by Allied soldiers, and after the war, it became the West German Bundeswehr's service pistol, one of the few WWI-era designs trusted enough to carry forward into the Cold War. Not the best of the war, but an excellent service pistol.
3. Browning High Power, Allied Forces. Here's where the story gets strange and a little beautiful. John Moses Browning designed the high power before his death in 1926. It was completed by Dieudonné Safe at FN in Belgium, entering production in 1935. Chambered in 9mm parabellum with a 13-round magazine, 13 rounds, when most contemporary pistols carried 7 or 8. That double-stack magazine was a genuine tactical advantage. More rounds before a reload in a gun that was still slim enough to carry comfortably. Then, the war happened. Germany occupied Belgium, seized the FN factory, and began producing the high power for German use. It was designated the Pistole 640B, the B for Belgian. At the same time, the high power design had been licensed, and Canada was producing them at the John Inglis Company in Toronto for Allied forces. British paratroopers, Canadian infantry, and Chinese nationalist forces all carried the Inglis high power. The same gun on both sides of the war. The same blueprints. The same Browning genius. Pointed at each other across France and the Netherlands. The high power went on to serve with militaries around the world for decades after 1945. Some nations only retired it within the last 10 years. That's a legacy.
2. Luger P08, Germany. I have to be honest, purely as a pistol, as a piece of engineering, the Luger P08 might be the most beautiful military sidearm ever made.
George Luger's toggle lock action is mechanically unlike anything else on this list. Watch the action cycle. The toggle breaks upward in a way that looks almost organic, almost biological, compared to the clinical slide of a conventional semi-automatic. It's strange, it's elegant, and it works. The Luger P08, chambered in 9mm parabellum, a cartridge that George Luger himself helped develop, was accurate, well-balanced, and had the kind of trigger pull that modern competition shooters still admire. So why isn't it number one? Because it had weaknesses that a war has no patience for. The Luger was tight, machined to close tolerances that demanded clean ammunition and clean operating conditions. Mud, sand, ice, the grit of the Eastern Front, the Luger could choke where rougher guns kept running. It was expensive to produce and required skilled labor to manufacture correctly. As the war dragged on and Germany's industrial capacity strained under Allied bombing and material shortages, quality declined. Allied soldiers prized Lugers as trophies above almost any other weapon of the war. And that tells you something too, not just about its performance, but about its presence. Some objects carry weight beyond their function. The Luger is one of them. World-class engineering, with one Achilles heel that a war eventually found.
1. M1911A1, United States. When the United States Army formally adopted John Browning's pistol design in 1911, they didn't know it would still be in frontline service 75 years later. The M1911A1, the updated variant that saw service in World War II, was chambered in .45 ACP, 45. That's a large, slow, heavy bullet compared to the 9mm rounds favored by most other nations, and it carries 7 rounds in the magazine, plus 1 in the chamber. On paper, that sounds like a disadvantage, 7 rounds versus the high power's 13. In practice, the .45 ACP round at close range had stopping power that settled arguments quickly. Soldiers who used both the 1911 and captured 9mm pistols frequently expressed a preference for the .45 in close-quarters combat. The round transferred energy to the target in a way that smaller, faster calibers sometimes didn't. But here's the thing that puts the 1911 at number 1: reliability. The 1911's tilting barrel, short recoil action was remarkably tolerant of the kind of abuse that combat inflicts on equipment: mud, sand, salt water, neglect. American forces fought in the Pacific jungles, the North African desert, the Italian mountains, the hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen Ardennes. The 1911 ran in all of it. Manufacturing was scaled to industrial quantities. Over 1.9 million were produced during the war by multiple manufacturers, including Colt, Remington Rand, Ithaca, and Union Switch and Signal. And perhaps the most telling endorsement, U.S. Special Operations Forces were still carrying the M1911 into combat in the early 2000s, nearly a century after its adoption, not because they couldn't get something newer, because they chose not to. John Browning designed the number 1 and number 3 guns on this list. He helped enable the number 2. One man, an extraordinary legacy.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below. Comment any suggestion for future videos. Thanks for watching.